Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how we can detect the touch on a specific object. So let's head into Android Studio, and here I'm going to start with an application called Touch an Object. And let's go ahead and get started with our code. Here, I'm going to go to my activity main. I'm going to actually make an object that I want to basically detect the touches on it. Let's say we don't have this text view. Instead, I actually have a view, the simplest of the objects. A view is just a simple square that doesn't really do anything. It can be used as container for other objects, but it doesn't really do anything on its own. I'm going to go ahead and say the background for it. Let's say the background for it is this kind of orange, yellow, red kind of color, and it's called red view. So I've called it red view. And now I'm going to go ahead and say it is actually 500 dp, which is actually too much, I think. 300 dp by 300 dp. So it's got the same width and height, and also it is centered horizontally and centered vertically. So it's right in the middle of my screen, and it is called a red view. And that's all I'm going to be doing in my interface builder. Now I'm going to head into my main activity. Now, writing the code to detecting a touch on an object is rather simple, but I want to show you a few different ways so we get a bit more confidence in terms of writing code in Kotlin. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to say red view, and then I'm going to say red view dot set on touch listener. There are a few different types of methods that we can use in here. For now, I'm going to use this one, and I'm going to say we get the view, we get the motion event, and then within here we have to actually do our code. The very first thing I want to do is I want to say let's get the view, whatever is the view in here, and then do a perform click. So I'm going to say perform click, and that basically gets rid of that little warning that you had over there. And now the rest of it is exactly like what we did in our previous lesson. This is our motion event. Our motion event has something called action mask. The action mask knows whether the action is up or down or move or whatever, and then you do a stuff depending on that. So for instance, I could go ahead and say when, let's say motion event that action mask. So I'm inlining everything. I'm putting everything together in one line instead of writing it separately. I'm going to say when motion event action mask. Let's go ahead and say, for instance, I could say motion event dot action down. So in the mode of the action down, do this, and then I'm going to go ahead and say there is another one, motion event dot action up. In the action up, I want to do this other thing. And just like the last time, within any of these, we actually have to return a value. So I'm going to go ahead and say in this one, we return true. Also in this one, we return true. And then there is still one more condition that the when is actually warning us about. There is a little, red underline, squiggly line under it that says there's still one condition that you haven't taken care of, and that is the else. So I'm going to say if none of these things was happening, let's go ahead and say it is also true. So you have to make sure you take care of all the different conditions if it is a situation like this one that the touch event wants to know which one is happening. And now for us, the only thing I really wanted to try in here was this. So I could go ahead and say toast, and then I'm going to say toast in here and do toast of red view was touched. And that's pretty much all I want to do in here. So red view, set on touch listener, perform click, and then find what kind of touch has been done, and then decide what do you want to do when that touch lands on it. I'm going to go ahead and run this application now. Let me boot up my Android emulator, and from now, if the application loads up, I should be able to touch on the red view, but not anywhere else. So here when I touch, nothing happens. The red view, when I touch, it says red view was touched. And you can imagine that you can simply expand on this application and make it that for any object that you touch, you can find the name of that object and show it, or you could change some sort of properties on them, a scale of them, the alpha of them, or whatever that you want to be doing for that particular application. Now, I told you earlier on at the beginning that I want to show you a few different ways of writing this code, and let's have a look at how else we could write it. And if you're wondering why I would want to suggest another way, is simply because if you keep writing the code like this within the body of your onCreate, soon enough your onCreate would be rather busy. And that's basically what I'm trying to avoid in here. I'm trying to find a way that I don't write everything within the body of my onCreate. Unfortunately, this part of it, the red view set on touch listener of it, it must happen within the onCreate. There are obviously other ways of mitigating this situation. For instance, you could come in here and say, I'm going to close my onCreate function here. I'm going to add a new function. I'm going to call it my touch function, for instance, and then this my touch function does all of these things. So I'm going to put the my touch within my onCreate. This way I can modularize my code a little bit so things become a little bit cleaner. There is another way, which is this type, the return that we want for the untouched listener. I'm actually going to go ahead and put it within a new function. So let's see how I'm going to do that. I'm going to say this is another function. Let's say this function, let's call it my touch return, or anything that you want to be calling it. The thing that really matters about this function is that it returns a view.onTouchListener. And you probably have to import your view, which is by holding Alt and Enter and saying import. And now I've got a function called myTouchReturn that returns a view.onTouchListener. And now I could go ahead and say for this one, we have to write the body of it. The one thing that's very important is that we have to return some value from it. So I'm going to say value, my touch value, let's call it that, is going to be view.onTouchListener, if I can type it correctly, onTouchListener. And then the onTouchListener in here is very similar to the one that we used over there. It could be exactly the same piece of code. In fact, I'm actually going to copy this entire code because it's going to be exactly like that. So I'm going to say my onTouchListener is something like that. Again, it has a view, it has a motion event. Again, we do perform click. Again, we decide about all of these things. The one thing that's going to be different in this function is that once we calculated all of that, here at the end of this onTouchListener, I'm going to say return. And what do I want to return? I want to return my touch value. You could, of course, do this whole thing in one go. You could actually say, instead of putting it within an argument, I could say just return. Let me copy this. I could say just return this entire thing. And now that's another way of modularizing your code and making sure that your code goes into a separate function, and this way you have a cleaner code when it comes to your onCreate. Now the way you could be using this one is very simple. I could go ahead and say, let's comment that one out. Let's say red view, and in the red view I'm going to say set onTouchListener, and then the set onTouchListener, one of them, this one, wants a return which is of the type view and motion event. And that's exactly what we have in here. We have a view listener. So I'm going to say set onTouchListener, my touch return. So it automatically calculates everything that you want for that view, and you add that as a listener for it. So a few different ways of doing it. Either you put this entire thing within the body of your onCreate, or you put a new function with a return type that you need, and then obviously you can call that function within your onTouchListener. As always, you could put these in separate files to make sure that your code doesn't become bloated really easily. The reason I keep suggesting about this modularizing and maintenance of code at these earlier stages is simply because soon enough you will have applications with hundreds of lines of code, and you can't just be putting them all within one file. It would be very cluttered. It would be very difficult to read, not just for you, for anyone who wants to work with you. And it's just basically a good practice of knowing how to keep your code very clean and very well organized to be very readable. So that's about that for touching a particular object. Let's keep it up to here, and let's move on to our next lesson.